Well, I'm very grateful for the chance to welcome you all to the Spring 2023 Leadership Lecture Series. I am Dr. Nicola Pitchford. I have the honor of being the president of Dominican University of California. This Leadership Lecture Series, as many of you know, is a program of Dominican's Institute for Leadership Studies, which is a regional leadership development center offering education and training, guiding students and professionals to become better leaders and better team members. The Leadership Lecture Series is partnership with Book Passage, the San Francisco Bay Area's prized independent bookstore, which is more than a bookstore. It is also a community center, and it is a real local treasure. And through the deep experience and network and expertise of Elaine and Bill Petrocelli, we are delighted to have access to writers of a caliber we might not otherwise be able to bring to our community and to our students. So we are tremendously grateful for this partnership, which, as Elaine said, has lasted 18 years, and this is the 151st event in the partnership. So my thanks, absolutely, to Elaine and Bill for their commitment to education and community building and inclusivity. As silver sponsor of this evening's event, Dominican University of California's Women's Leadership and Philanthropy Council, which is a giving circle inspiring women to lead, collaborate, and contribute, is very excited to welcome you this evening. And I would also like to say special thanks to our partner, the County of Marin Office of Equity, and County Director of Equity, Jamila Jordan, for co-hosting a number of our events this spring. We are delighted, through the County Office of Equity's Community at the Table Speaker Series, to have this partnership. Our distinguished speaker this evening, Silvia Vasquez-Lavado, is a humanitarian, mountaineer, explorer, social entrepreneur, activist, and technologist living in San Francisco. In 2014, she launched Courageous Girls, a nonprofit organization that provides survivors of sexual abuse and human trafficking with opportunities to find and to exercise inner strength and to uplift their voices through exercising their physical strength. Silvia Vasquez-Lavado was recognized by Fortune magazine as one of the corporate heroes of 2015. CNET had previously named her one of the 20 most influential Latinos and Latinas in Silicon Valley. Vasquez-Lavado is a member of the Explorers Club, and she is one of the few women in the world to have completed the 7 summits. Just this past month, Silvia Vasquez-Lavado was awarded the Edward Stanford Travel Book of the Year for In the Shadow of the Mountain. Tonight, she will be discussing that book in conversation with another special guest, Amanda Machado, a writer, public speaker, and facilitator whose work explores how race, gender, sexuality, and power affect the ways we travel and the ways we experience the outdoors. Amanda's work has been published in The Atlantic, The Washington Post, NBC News. She's been featured in The New York Times, in National Geographic, in Outside Magazine, Vox, and many other publications, radio programs, and blogs. Amanda is also a speaker and workshop facilitator on issues of justice and anti-oppression for such organizations as Patagonia and the North Face. They are also the founder of Reclaiming Nature Writing. And this has a special interest to me, both as a nature writer and as someone who was most recently on a mountain at about 7:30 this morning. It was only a small Marin mountain, but an actual mountain. Reclaiming Nature Writing is a multi-week online workshop that expands how we tell stories about nature in a way that takes into consideration issues like ancestry, colonization, and migration trauma. And I would say from my own experience that work of inclusivity is long overdue in the field of nature writing and indeed in the American outdoor industry. So I am delighted, and please join me to welcome Silvia Vasquez-Lavado and Amanda Machado.
Everyone, thank you so much for coming. Thank you, Silvia. Bienvenidos a todos.
Muchísimas gracias por estar acá. No vamos a hacer la entrevista en español, pero...
Yeah, we're just joking. We're not going to do this in Spanish. It's so wonderful to be here tonight with all of you. I really just want to start by thanking you. I started climbing mountains and hiking when I was 24 years old, which was now a decade ago. And when I was doing that, there simply were no narratives for people that looked like me. There were no women of color, no queer women, no survivors, no people with ancestry from the Andes. And so when I found you and found your book, it was just such a mesmerizing moment to see all of those identities that I had reflected finally in adventure narratives and in narratives about nature. So I'm just so grateful that you're here and that you wrote this book. I'm so grateful that these narratives are existing, and it just shows that there's such a shift in what is now possible, right, for people that hold identities like us.
Thank you so much.
So thank you so much. Thank you so much for being here. And yeah, what I wanted to start talking about first was this culture of silence that you bring up so many times in this book. Silence shows up a lot, and how you end up deciding to break the silence by writing this book. And I know we both come from Latin American families, where I know in my family the phrase was bien calladita más bonita, which meant, the quieter you are, the more beautiful you are. And this is a really common phrase in Mexico and in many other parts of Latin America. And I just feel like there was always this culture of, in the spirit of collectivism, which is very strong in Latin America, we tell the story of our families, we tell the story of the collective, but that means sometimes that's at the cost of not telling our individual story, right? Especially if our individual story talks about taboos like sexual abuse or queerness or the many other things that you talk about in this book. So I'm just so curious, how did you navigate that culture of silence, that tension between individually telling your story and the collectivism of Latin America when you were thinking about writing this?
Thank you so much. And first and foremost, I am just so grateful to this opportunity, being here at Dominican University. I've attended many of the events prior to the pandemic, and it's a beautiful full circle moment. And I'm so also humbled to be here in front of you, Amanda, but thank you so much for all your work. But yeah, what a great question to start with. I feel, for me, for the longest time, kind of keeping silence was almost possibly more valuable just to save face for the family. And we just didn't want to be one of those families who will spill everything out. And it was all about what, lo que dirán, qué es lo que van a decir, which is like what others will say, in a way. And I think especially, having been raised by a mother who had to hide so much of herself, who literally couldn't really even find her voice. I thought it was really hard for me, and I just didn't want to hurt her. And even for me, the idea of writing the book didn't really happen until 2017. And of course, unfortunately, like many women, I was self-doubting, could my story mean anything? But this is, and I know, well, growing up, my mother had a hard time every time we'll come across the issue of my abuse. Every time something would happen, something would trigger, and it kind of affected her. So I think that I wanted to protect her, but also I think I wasn't very comfortable with myself in terms of embodying the experience that I wanted to bring out in the world. I still was very much drinking, and I wasn't able to be sober. So I think there were a lot of conflicting emotions for me, which possibly didn't allow me to stand up to own my voice. And ultimately, it was after my first anniversary of climbing Everest that I got into a horrible bike accident, which landed me in the ICU for about 10 days. And while I was there, I discovered that I had a small brain tumor at the base of my brainstem, that I felt almost the pressure that life was a ticking clock with me, and that I just couldn't keep my story inside. And I think it was that possibly push for me to eventually, started putting it out there. I gotta find a way of me sharing this story. But but I also needed to come clean with my drinking. And so it was, there were still a lot of complexities. I wanted to complete climbing the 7 summits in a way that I felt maybe I could, tell a full story of achieving something in particular and be able to relate it with just my emotions with trauma. But it took a while. And I do now advise people who sometimes get very sensitive about not oversharing because of their families. There's never going to be a good time. Mm-hmm. I mean, even one of my brothers tried to sue me before the book came out because he was too embarrassed of everything that I was touching. So there's never going to be a good time to do it. You just need to trust that your voice, that your truth needs to prevail among anything else.
Yeah.
And go with it.
That makes sense, yeah. And I one of the lines you have in the book, particularly to the topic of sexual abuse, you said sexual violence thrives on the assumption that no one will tell the truth. And that just really hit me hard when I read that in the book. And it made me think about the movements now, like Me Too, which have started to challenge that, right, by trying to share these narratives more often. In Latin America, we have Ni Una Menos, which is a really similar movement to Me Too. So I guess I'm curious how those movements affected you as you were thinking about writing this book. How they affect you now, how you see your book in relationship to those movements.
Yes, and I was very lucky that I mean, and it was so funny because I had been climbing for a long time, and the Peruvian community, the country itself, they had never really cared, if anything. And I was never doing it to get attention. I mean, as I started climbing, I remember I had a couple of interviews, and it never created any traction, but I knew this wasn't just to kind of generate additional attention. I was doing this as a way of fulfilling a promise, just for my own and a way for finding healing. So it was interesting, but in 2016, after I summited Everest, I became the prodigal daughter in my country. I was this hero or heroine that really surprised me. And one of the things that was beautiful is that my story, in conjunction with a couple of other women's stories, became almost a boiling point for having the Ni Una Menos movement, in which we had about 1 million people. Literally, there were more than 1 million people walking with us. And it was so powerful to be leading this march. And I mean, I think what was really painful is that for the longest time, I kept feeling, well, I went through this, hopefully things have changed. And to see that, no, that is still, if anything, the struggle continues. And so it was great because I think Ni Una Menos in Peru was continuing the tradition of what they had started in Argentina, which ultimately, I think, led into the Me Too movement. And I feel, I mean, these movements are important. They create community. I mean, what has been beautiful about a big part of the book is you can tell the sense of community is what brings healing to me. And these movements are community. You know, for many of us who are survivors, sometimes we feel a little bit scared. We feel kind of like, well, I don't want to be the only one. And that's the beauty of these movements. I mean, whenever you've attended, and I think even after the election of the unfortunate president in 2016, in 2017, I mean, the big march that happened in D.C., the pink hats, I mean, there was community, there was movement. So to me, these movements need to keep on going. I mean, right now, there's going to be a big movement supporting drag queens and our trans community. Movements are important, and I think we just have to show the solidarity.
Yeah, and telling the story becomes kind of like a domino effect, right? You tell one, and then all of a sudden it all starts crumbling down really quickly.
Absolutely.
In the book, you share so many examples of the sexism you experienced in the sport of mountaineering, the misogyny you experienced. You even mentioned, like, the gear is catered towards men, right? The gear can't even fit the bodies of a lot of women. You even described the summit expedition. You talked about looking around and looking at your team, the people who are supposed to help you summit to the top of the mountain, and you realize it's all mostly white men, straight men, cis men. And this is the last time that you can't remember the last time you had to put this much trust in men as that moment when you have to do that in order to summit the mountain. And that was really powerful for me to think about how you had to literally put your life as a survivor, as a queer woman, in these men's hands, in order to do the thing that you did. So I'm just curious, how did you hold the complexity of having all those identities in a sport that's been so led by people with identities that are not like you?
That's Great, great question. I feel that maybe the connection started on my own purpose. I never saw myself as conquering a mountain. I think the very first time that I came across, the Himalayas, I felt my smallness, and it was something that had, in terms of my very, very logical brain, to feel that, yeah, I'm going to conquer something like this that has been in existence for much longer than I ever will. I think the fact that I always saw myself on any of these expeditions as a journey of surrendering, of actually asking compassion from the mountain, in a way took the fear that in a way took the fear away that, okay, well, I'm here to compete with this man. And I remember joining when I arrived into Everest and realized that I would be the only woman. It was one of those emotions about, of course, why not? But also, I've been very fortunate that every single journey has tested me in a particular way. I feel that, luckily for me, by the time I got to the base of Everest, I had spent this life-changing journey with the young women who had taught me so much. Mm-hmm. And even though my heart felt incredibly vulnerable, and even though a lot of my body was scared of what I was going to experience, I just felt, this started as a promise, and I literally was honoring the little girl inside of me, and that's one of the beautiful things about a lot of these journeys, that I don't go there to socialize. I've never, I don't go there to find a husband. First I'm gay. I think I do. Just to be upfront, I remember that I started the first couple of expeditions. I'm like, wouldn't it be nice if I'm on this mountain expedition and I meet this other queer woman, and oh my goodness, we're 10 mates, and then, wow, we're meant to be.
That's the rom-com version of your book.
Yeah, well, but it never, after the second mountain, it wasn't happening. And if there was another woman, it was straight women, who was married, and this and that, and, another friend. And so I just I already gave up on the notion, and so usually I wasn't doing any expedition to meet anyone in terms of, kind of having this, this romantic thing. It was always about my own personal journey. And so even when coming across these guys, I remember, I'll never forget that very first meeting. First of all, I'm showing up late, and then I'm the only vegetarian, gluten-free vegetarian women, lesbian vegetarian women in the expedition. And I remember just feeling the ego and just kind of hearing the smack, and there was a part of me that at first got scared, but I also knew that this was going to be a long journey. And even after seeing possibly the two strongest men leaving so soon, it really shook me to realize, wow, it doesn't matter the big talk. And I think for many of us, and one of the big lessons that I got from Everest, the big talk we're never going to be able to control. That's, unfortunately for some people, that's their own ammo, that's their own way of protecting themselves. But just for us to realize that's just a cloud, it's a passing cloud. Let that go. If you are chasing a particular dream, if you're going after something, just trust that purpose. Mm-hmm. And that is going to overpower any fear, I think.
Yeah, it's such a different framework to mountaineering than we usually see from predominantly men and male stories, right? Which is often so much about conquering. And I love the passages you have. I have a few of them here that I want to read out loud about this idea of the summiting as being very different than conquering and having it be more about surrender. You said, I've lived and practically died by the ethos that to survive is to overcome. But again and again, mountains have shown me that strong is not the opposite of soft, that they are symbiotic. Strength alone is not enough. It may get me to the summit, but back at sea level, I'll still be adrift. And now the courageous girls, the women that you took on the trip to Everest Base Camp, have shown me that I can bow at the feet of lamas and nuns, speak the language of the New Age, wear all the shawls and rosaries and prayer beads, and adopt the vernacular of healing. But as long as I neglect the muscle of softening, I will still be conquering where I wish to surrender. Mm-hmm. Which I really, really loved. And there's another line, too, that I just want to read because they're so beautiful. I've been asking myself if I'm strong enough to keep up, to make it to the top, but maybe that's the wrong question. Maybe I should be asking if I'm soft enough to listen. Mm-hmm. to yield, to trust something deep inside, something in my bloodline, my heritage, that undercuts logic and strength. This is just such a different approach to mountaineering than I had ever seen. And this idea that it doesn't have to be about conquering, but it's actually about surrender, just really seems to go against everything that the history of mountaineering and its entanglement with colonialism also goes into, right? Like this idea that we can conquer land, that we are bigger than nature, that humans are somehow more in control than nature and can defeat it, right? I think that's been so entangled in the history of mountaineering over time. And this is just such a different approach. So I'm just so curious to hear, like, how do you see that? How have you thought about yourself in like being in right relationship to mountains and to nature as you're doing this sport?
So one of the things, being raised in Peru, we had this reverence to the word of conquistadores, the conquerors. And I will never forget through history, it was always, we were maybe believed that possibly if it wasn't because of the conquerors, what would have happened of us? Like, we owe them so much. And so there was this already, I guess, false sense of reverence to them. And in a way, that's why I never got into, climbing mountains wasn't ever a consideration for me being in Peru, because every single time I would hear of somebody, it's like, they conquered a mountain. I'm like, yeah, I'm scared of conquering. So, and I think that, and that's what I love about that very first journey while visiting the Himalayas, and just for me to be that open, to feel my space, to realize that if I wanted to follow this, and there's no way that conquering is going to do. Conquering, at the end of the day, destroys. At the end of the day, it's about somebody needs to win, and that has never been. And I think the more that I was working in my healing, what became very clear is that with conquering, you don't bring. It doesn't include any healing. You don't bring any light, and so I feel that, and that's what has been very exciting for me to have been able to write a book and be able to show the way that I relate to mountains as opposed to conquering. I'm so excited that we're bringing the book in Spanish very soon, because that's going to hit pretty hard as well in terms of the way the culture has been led. But personally for me, I look back at so many of our indigenous cultures. When I go back, I was doing a research for an assignment that I had, and in the Inca culture, it came across that one of the founding warriors, a female warrior, people were scared of her because she used to talk to the mountains. And it really resonated with me in terms of and the Incas were huge about respecting the tallest mountains that surrounded them. And so it's given me a lot of hope that we are at a point in our, I think, in this particular time, that we're looking at the way indigenous cultures are relating to nature. And if anything, we are now having a little bit more appreciation to it. And so, I dream that we will get rid of the term conquering. But if anything, if we can just understand the power that it can give us, and I think a lot of that depends as to the way that we look at things. And what I have discovered is that to embrace vulnerability and to embrace healing is at times tougher than to try to overpower. Because there is, by you opening yourself up and by making yourself vulnerable, you can get hurt. But the beauty that eventually that will bring to you is 100 times that the whole idea of conquering.
It's a totally different kind of strength.
It is a very, it's something that I keep pushing. Vulnerability, crying. That was one of I guess I had and it's interesting because I remember I will never forget that experience when I was in Aconcagua and I'm having this massive emotional breakdown. And something for me awakened there as well. And I remember as I was crying, and I've always found strength in crying. That was great to make fun of myself as the Machito Llorón instead of, Wonder Woman. But there's something about, and I love, because I think in Aconcagua I had the first opportunity to really feel that, wow, by really allowing myself to release, to be in touch with that vulnerability, magic can happen. So that's one of my open wishes for, to put it out. If we can just keep embracing that vulnerability, how things can change.
It also, to me, connects so much to your narrative about sexual abuse, because to me, I also see the colonial mentality so connected to rape culture, where there's also this idea of conquering not land, but now bodies, right? And that you're entitled to other people in a similar way. And I just think about how even at least in Ecuador, I've heard the term conquista to be used when you're like flirting with someone. Like, le voy a conquistar is like, I'm going to conquer her, is like a term for like, I'm gonna like grab her, I'm gonna make her my girlfriend, the colloquialism of that, the fact that like casually we use the same word in how we relate to each other romantically. To me, it just seems so like entangled in your own narrative as a survivor. And I just thought that was just really beautifully done throughout the book. So I've spoken to you since, and after you summited Everest, at this point now you're 5 years sober.
Yes.
But that did not happen immediately after coming down from the mountain. That happened after. As you said, the healing journey was longer and harder in some ways. So I would love to hear you say more about that. How was the healing of the mountain so different than the healing you had to do afterwards in sobriety?
I feel that one of the books, and that's why it was so important for me to keep quoting Bessel van der Kolk, The Body Keeps Score. Every single journey that I've had in the mountains, even though maybe the healing effect wasn't something that happened right on the spot, it stayed with me. But I was dealing with an addiction that has outlasted any single relationship in my life. I started drinking at the age of 7, 8, mostly as a little family kind of type of gathering. But then when I got into college, that's when my drinking started making its appearance. When my uncle got me the fake ID, that didn't help. And then, joining a vodka company here, definitely, only fed into the addiction. So I was facing a massive mountain in terms of trying to surrender to my own addiction. And I feel that while climbing, in a way, I kind of had to, it's almost like it showed me a little bit about, it would put my life at risk. I couldn't have a hangover. And I think even when I finished Everest, I was quite overwhelmed with the attention, because I never had done this to kind of, get exposure, and I couldn't handle that. And so my drinking after Everest kind of gets out of control. That's how I end up in the hospital a year later, partying right before my first anniversary. And even after I remember after I got out of the ICU, I had to still have brain surgery. And I had in my dream to try to complete the last mountain, Denali, which had eluded me a couple of times. And in a way, mountains always would push me to kind of put the addiction on the side. But after Denali, I think that I felt, and I had a horrible episode with drinking. I had just gone to therapy, and after that session, a couple of friends were like, hey, why don't you join us on a local bar? And I was going through a breakup, and just my drinking got so out of control that I was almost 5 days sick. And that's when I realized this has to stop. You have completed this incredible mountain. This kind of crazy, I guess, life journey, and you are just about to just throw everything down. And it put me into a lot of reflection. And what was unique is that when I decided to get help, I didn't go the traditional road of 12 steps. It was the embracing of compassion cultivation, self-compassion, that literally spoke to me. And it was so powerful how it was almost like the missing piece that I needed to bring into my life. And I took about 4 of those classes. Before the pandemic, you could only do it. It was only in person. But after the pandemic, they've moved it online, and I keep recommending if I can have the opportunity of writing a second book, it would be about the power of self-compassion. But the embracing of self-compassion literally is what opened up my eyes of the damage that I had kept doing to myself, and how I could, give myself the strength to walk this life as a sober woman. I know that, throughout the book, what it is clear is the compassion that I have for others. And I was taught, and it's always tricky. I think the word compassion needs a facelift, because we all have it. I think many of us, just give it so generously. It's self-compassion that is this massive, massive, massive inner mountain to try to get. And I feel that is what has allowed me to walk this path. And I needed to, even as I was feeling that, okay, maybe this is a lifestyle that I can embrace, I needed to come clear to myself that, I would only give myself permission to write a book if I could see myself being sober for the rest of my life. And that is something that I'm committed, because I still see, and especially through the pandemic, just seeing so much pain, especially when we got locked in. People struggling, and even up to now with so much uncertainty. So, I think life has given me a second lease, and this is the least that I can do.
Yeah, in the book you mentioned geographical cures, and this idea that sometimes, which I saw a lot as a traveler too and as a hiker, this idea that if we change our environment, that will change the circumstances in our life. So we see this a lot with mountaineers, a lot with outdoorsy people, a lot with travelers. And that wasn't the case, right? And that's what you're speaking to, that this idea that you also have to do the internal healing work, the self-compassion work, in order to truly heal. And at the same time, I truly do believe, and there have been studies for this too, that changing our circumstances, using external environments can heal us to some extent, right? There's been there was a study at Berkeley that when they took hikers that had PTSD on hiking trips, the symptoms of PTSD decreased by 25%, simply by going on this trip. And when they tried to isolate what was the variable that caused the healing, it was actually awe. Like having that moment of, oh my gosh, this is so beautiful, and feeling that awe on the trip was what was healing the PTSD. So it feels like there's this tension, right, between external things that do truly heal us, and then the internal healing that we also have to do on our own. So I'm really curious how you sit with that tension, right? How did nature bring you that healing sense of awe? And then how did you mix that with the internal healing that now you're speaking of as well?
Yes, and I think maybe, I forgot to, sorry, I'm just gonna.
Yeah, let's show some pictures. We have some photos of.
Yes, I'm sorry, I forgot this, so they might not be in order, but let's see here. So I'm just gonna skip on a couple of these guys.
Although we have to go back to those.
We'll go back to those. But we're gonna go back to those. Okay, so I love this photo. This is the first time I was in the Himalayas in 2005, and hopefully you guys can see just a perspective. And I feel this is possibly the very first time as an adult that I felt awe, but the real sense of awe, what I was supposed to embrace. I think this is what allowed me to see my place in nature, and that's what I remember looking. I'm like, I'm gonna conquer this? No way. But these are the sides, and there is something that opens up in a person when we encounter. And of course, this is on the extreme side, being surrounded by the Himalayas. Not all of us, even though I encourage everybody to please try to try base camp, never late. But even, the awe of seeing a sunrise, or the awe of seeing a sunset. There's some beautiful spots in Marin County, and I can give you some of the locations where you can just see the most gorgeous sunsets, especially around Tennessee Valley. But this is one that really opened me up, and this one actually, when looking at Everest on the left, Nupsis on the right.
Oh, wow.
And this is actually on my way to the summit with the most massive pyramid forms. I have the passage of awe, maybe I can read it. Let's see.
Let me see if I can find it too.
Here, there we go. It's awe. It's the sense of being both small and a part of something so much bigger than our smallness. Awe is the gateway drug to healing trauma through nature. Awe must be experienced. And trauma isn't something you scoop out with a spoon. It has a home in you. And in that home, it lives often comfortably, sometimes quietly, but always ready to trash the place at a moment's notice. But as I said, awe is an emotion that you need to experience. You need to be, I can only describe this to you, but there's something so magical when you are able to just get that moment.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, I feel that is possibly what really opened me up, that, my world is not just limited to the box that I live on. And I think the encouragement is nature is just an unlimited supply of all. There are many other circumstances, but at least, and I love, for little children, on a daily basis, the world is an awe to them. They're constantly impressed. But as we grow older, we get jaded. But I think for us, maybe, nature is such a powerful healing opportunity and a supplier of just this emotion.
Yeah, that makes sense. Can we look at the other photos of
Absolutely.
at least of the group of women? So for those that haven't read the book, before Silvia got to the top of Everest, she took this group of women who are all survivors of sexual assault up to Everest Base Camp, and this is the group, right?
Yeah, this is the Nepali girls when we were starting the training. And then this is the final group of all of us. This is at Tukla Pass, beautiful spot about 2 days before reaching the base of Everest. And it is a monument for those who have unfortunately died. And I had the chance of going back to the base of Everest last October, and it really hit me how bigger this monument has gotten. There's now more and more people, and it's not just for the mountain. It's not just for Everest, but it's for a lot of the Himalayan mountains. So it's a very sacred spot and just beautiful views.
So in the book you mention how they were very integral in teaching you about the idea of vulnerability as being the biggest strength. You also write about the term survivor, which I thought was really interesting as a survivor myself. I have a complicated relationship with the term. And you write, when I called myself a survivor, it wasn't with pride, but with the corrosive mixture of arrogance and resentment. Survivorship was a suit I'd worn to hold all the loose, bloody pieces together. But I was starting to see how dangerous it was to assign merit to survival, to make it a part of your identity, because one day you wake up and realize that surviving is all you know how to do. Survive, and it's not nearly enough. So I'm just curious, what is your relationship with the word survivor now? How do you think about that? Especially in regards to your narrative as a survivor. We use that word so much in relationship to sexual assault, and yet, there's a lot of problematic parts of it.
I would say, to me, survivor is a necessary step to ultimately embracing you as a whole, your wholeness. And I think it's necessary, but the problem is don't get stuck there. And even for me, for the longest time, especially while drinking, I felt, well, I'm a survivor. I overcame. I'm still killing myself every night while drinking, but I'm a survivor. And so we have to be careful with actually that identity. I feel that it is a very powerful word, but the downside is that it keeps you in the same cycle of trauma. And I think it's necessary for any victim to be able to embrace that, they are on the way to kind of, reclaiming their own agency. They're on the way to reclaiming their strength. And so that is possibly, especially while drinking, I think I put a lot of emphasis of really claiming that narrative. But then I saw the danger that it can do. And that was so powerful to have these young women teaching me that to them, it wasn't just about surviving. And I love that in terms of the whole narrative of the book. I love how I start the journey with the young women feeling like I'm the one who's going to teach them. I'm the older one, I'm their leader. I should be the ones, hopefully, being able to pass down my wisdom. And it's the opposite. It's actually these young women who ultimately teach me the strength that they have, and actually opening up their own stories. And it's that vulnerability that really allows me to see the contrast between what I thought, the dangers of surviving.
Thank you so much. I have one more quote that I want to read because it was so impactful to me. Let me see if I can find it. There we go. As a queer person, I have never seen queerness in a Latinx context written about. So I really want to read this passage where you're writing about going to like a queer Latinx night in San Francisco. We rolled deep to the weekly Latino night at Bench and Bar in Oakland, where I danced to salsa and cumbia, my body awakening to the joy and safety of dancing with a same-sex partner. Singing lyrics to the music I grew up with, Alejandra Guzman, Maná, Shakira, in Spanish at the top of my lungs. In some ways, I felt more connected to my culture than I had been in Peru. The parts that I loved had always been dampened by the misogyny, by the restriction and abuse inflicted upon my body. Fear does not move to the beat, but the beat was finally pouring out of me. I was unlearning the idea of home, or maybe I was just starting to learn that for me, home might mean something else altogether. I just love this idea of relearning your connection to your own culture through queerness, because there's such a narrative of queerness being something that separates us from our culture. And I think also at a time like right now, where queer and trans people are so under attack politically, particularly trans people, there's just not a lot of narrative about how queerness, there's a lot of narratives about the tragedy of queerness, but not a lot about how queerness can actually reconnect you to a sense of home, reconnect you to your sense of your own body, give you a sense of joy and autonomy and agency over your own body, which are things I read into when I see a passage like this. I just wanted to say that I really appreciated this passage, and I am curious about how you see your queerness now in relation into this story and into the journey you've been on.
I mean, I love that I was able to share how seeing Gay Pride in San Francisco, the very first time I saw Gay Pride, it caused such an effect that it made me move here. And just important, there was an inclusion that I felt, and I don't know, I've had this theory that, I mean, and when I look at, the previous generation, the previous queer generation, they had to fight for their own identity. And ultimately, Gay Pride is a celebration of inclusiveness. I mean, you don't need to be gay to attend. And what I love about what drag queens, especially drag queens and drag kings, but a lot of drag queens, they take this identity of just bringing joy, of bringing acceptance. Who hasn't been to a drag show and comes out of that just feeling more, like relaxed, re-energized? If anything, you just have a great time. And so there is something in terms of the sense of acceptance and also the sense of safety. I have never attended any gay event and had to feel that, God, somebody's going to be hitting on me the wrong way, or, I'm going to be assaulted. At least that hasn't been the experience for me. And so in the sense of these parties, there was such a joy. And in our cultures, unfortunately, still in Latin America, as much progress as we're doing, being gay is always looked upon like, something possibly went wrong with the family. But I find it that, now, especially for what we're seeing on so much hate, I guess, and that's more fear. We need to stand up. I mean, we need to realize that it's that openness that has allowed us to expand, our own sense of acceptance. And I think right now all of that is under attack. I mean, not just right now, queer culture, but even women. I mean, it's so sad that instead of making progress, what's been happening? You know, Roe versus Wade, 50 years, just what happened there?
Mm-hmm.
So to me, you know, I think we are, you know, just at times when you feel like, I think during the Obama era, I felt like, okay, you know, things might be going one particular way, and then you're like, okay, what's going on? But this is our time to stand up, to get our voice back. And so to me, what was important with bringing such an open narrative, and actually in a way too, what I was very purposeful when talking about my queerness in the book, even though it becomes an identity, you also see on the other side, you know, when addiction gets on the way, how, you know, I lose the love of my life. And you know, it no longer it is no longer about love is love, loss is loss.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's almost that roller coaster that I want to take. I mean, the reader, in terms of like you see this woman embracing her queerness, and you know, it's not going to be a very happy ending, because ultimately, you know, when addiction gets a vulnerability, or the fear of intimacy and just addiction get on the way, you know, I mean, it pushes me to definitely have this horrible loss experience, and it still is one of the driving forces to keep climbing. But in a way, I wanted people to feel that, yeah, loss is loss. And I have enjoyed, you know, getting the feedback from men who, you know, they get very moved about those chapters. And just, and even as I've been working on the Spanish translation, that's going to be really big for me. And I got some feedback of some of the male editors really crying and having a hard time because they didn't see that coming. So it's another way for me to allow people to feel that, yeah, I mean, love is love, but yet loss is loss. And you know, it's been able to embrace the whole, you know, spectrum.
Thank you so much. There's so much more to talk about in this book, but we have to also get to questions, which were so great that you all submitted. I also want to share the photo of you, the childhood photos, which are mentioned throughout the book as a photo that you used to feel shame about. You used to look at this photo and be ashamed of what you saw. Hopefully we can get it.
So let's go. This is, I love this photo. They used it on the UK cover, my first communion, but this is the little girl that started it all. This is me with the Turkish tracksuit, and who is at the top of Everest. I left her at the top of Everest, and that she's the one that appeared to me on the ayahuasca, and little did she know what a journey would have been.
Yeah, in the book you mentioned first looking at this photo, not even wanting to look at it, and by the end of the book, it's the photo that keeps you going and the photo you put on the summit when you summit Everest.
And that's what is really funny, because I remember, and for those who know me, they know that I don't pay, I mean, my spatial awareness is pretty bad. I don't pay attention to what, you know, people's haircuts or, you know, things that have changed. It sucks. So I remember when looking at this photo, the rage, the anger, the frustration, just almost like looking at this girl, I remember just being like so mad at her. I never saw what was surrounding her, and that's what it was very special.
Snowman.
The snowman at the end.
The first hint that she would be at Everest, maybe.
Yes, that was the irony, that my destiny was all behind me.
What would you tell this little girl today, if you could talk to her right now?
I would tell her that she is whole. I would tell her that she's so brave. You know, she's so strong, and that nothing has changed. That she's still angelical, and that she's going to have a wild ride ahead of her.
Thank you so much, Silvia. We're going to get to the questions. Thank you so much. Let's see. I have a few minutes. So I just learned that Silvia's book won a Stanford Travel Award, which is a really prestigious award in travel writing. So congratulations on that. I also learned that there's a film adaptation coming for the memoir. So this question is, are you consulting on the film adaptation? Are you a part of that process? And if not, are you concerned about how it will be executed?
That's a great question. I am very lucky that I am one of the executive producers of the film. And I spent the first 6 weeks of this year helping on the revision of the script. We have completed, I think, the second pass of the script, and right now we've sent it to Sabina and her team to get feedback. But the book is quite almost 3 books at once, and it was going to be really hard to bring all of it into a film. So I'll give you a little hint. The 3 photos that I leave at the end is what the film is about. And the second version, I'm very excited. I was able to put a lot of, the book journey has its own unique learnings. The film journey is having its own unique learnings. I'm very grateful that I'm still gay, I'm Latina. There's a love story with another woman. So
that's not nothing in Hollywood.
That's
to have kept those things in.
So those are things that actually had my check. We had to exaggerate on the mountain, which I'm a shy person, so they're making me look more of a badass, I think, on the mountain. But I can live with that. So it's coming along. So hopefully, I think if things move okay, maybe we'll start looking at production sometime towards the end of the year, if not next year. But it's very exciting. I feel there is a lot of opportunities. Unfortunately, in Hollywood, the narrative with a lot of Latin characters is not the greatest. But here's to hoping.
Mm-hmm. This one is, how has there been a trekker that has specifically inspired you? Someone who hiked or summited mountains before you that inspired you?
Yes, Junko Tabei.
And who is that?
The first woman who summited Everest, and the first woman who completed the 7 summits, who unfortunately passed away. I am hell-bent into hopefully getting Mattel to do a Barbie of her. Do you think we should do that? Yes! The book just came out in Japan, and I'm trying to make my way there, and it doesn't hurt that I love sushi, but that's on my listing of dreams, and so I think it's about time. So I think that would be a way. And it was funny because when I was starting to do the research for the book, I was hoping she had published a memoir, but she hadn't. And all the stories, any books that I've written on her, is afterwards. I think she unfortunately still had to put up with the idea that she was the first woman, there are not a lot of them, and so I think it's a way of honoring. So
yeah, we need her story.
Yeah, so that's on my radar of being able to bring forward.
This one has a little bit to do with what our questions were about adrenaline and addiction. Is there an adrenaline to climbing that is addictive and has to be ratcheted up, like increased each time? Worrying one summit is never enough. You spoke about this a little bit, but...
Yeah, it's really funny. I think I had never climbed Peru. I had never climbed a mountain in Peru until 2 years ago. And I almost died on my way down. And I was really bummed because I remember somehow I discovered that because of my brain tumor, I cannot climb any mountain really fast. And all the expeditions that I have done, we pace ourselves in a way, so I've been very lucky. But I was doing this all-women expedition. There were two Bolivians, 2 Argentinians, and they were hardcore climbers. And we started at, I think, 17,000 feet, and I got affected really badly. And even though we had a couple of people with pulmonary edema, I was able to summit, but on the way down, I had cut the amount of oxygen intake that I literally was like dying. And at one point when I was being, I remember being confused and being like, why am I fainting? And it's like, well, what's going on? And my blood pressure was at 20, and I realized like, oh, something's not right. But I remember looking at the mountain and just being bummed about, God, my first mountain in Peru, and this is it. And I remember also taking accountability and feeling like, I put myself here, I wasn't prepared. So it kind of at times now, I've always made a promise that I'm never going to put other people in danger when it comes to climbing, when it comes to doing some of these adventures. I want to go back to do the Triple Crown next year, which is to climb Everest, Nuptse, and Lhotse. But I have to get into my best shape ever, and I'm going to be very responsible about it. So adrenaline is amazing to experience, but then you need to figure out where is it coming from. I mean, if it's coming from a place of ego, if it's coming from a place of, well, I need to do this because in a way I want to conquer or show somebody else that I've conquered, then I think that is almost a potential danger. But if it's coming from a place of, let me embrace this journey, let me see what are the learnings from it, and also to understand that what is that turning point, or where do you need to realize that, that you can't push forward when you hit a particular wall, and determine where that wall is going to happen. I think you can manage adrenaline. So it just depends as to ultimately which is what is pushing you to do that. If it's more because you are trying to prove that you're better than anybody else, and if ego is the driving force, then that's a little dangerous.
Yeah. The other question is, has love and relationships been elusive? Has your adventure and travel stood in the way?
I was really bummed that, in all the summits, I definitely hadn't, I was single in all my single summits. And the only one, the last one, I was in a relationship, but I came down and then we broke up, so. I don't know what's the message there.
How do your friends root for you? How do your friends or family, do they root for you? Do they try to distract themselves because they're so nervous? Or how does your family and friends react to this?
They really are like, yeah, whatever. I think it's funny. I still hold that wish that I'm going to go on my next expedition and my tent mate is going to be this lesbian that we're going to be forever match. But I think it's just been tricky. And in the last couple of years as well, as I was getting sober, I realized that I needed to give myself that priority. And it was possibly the very first time in many decades of kind of getting to know me really well. So. And now with the book and a lot of these amazing, opportunities, it's kind of taking a second. I'm getting too lazy, I think, but eventually I'll have to get up there.
Sylvia, thank you so much. Thank you all so much.
No, thank you, everybody. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Sylvia and Amanda. This has been a truly moving experience. Even though I had read the book twice, I found out things tonight that were enlightening and fabulous. And thank you for what you're doing and for what you're doing for girls. It's a beautiful story, even though there's a lot of pain. And Amanda Machado, you are a wonder. We're so glad we met you. Thank you for this really fabulous interview. To all of you who are here, I'm so glad you all have a book, because when you come by Book Passage, tell me what you think, because you are going to have an experience tonight. And I hope I'll see you soon, either here or somewhere else, but it's just a real privilege to be part of Dominican's Institute for Leadership Studies, to work with the County of Marin's Office of Diversity, and to be part of the Women's Philanthropy Circle. I never get the name right, I'm sorry. But you all know what I mean. Huge thanks. I just cannot tell you how much I'm moved by what you did. Thank you.
Thank you so much.